Order. Order. Well, good morning, colleagues, and in particular, a warm welcome to our witness, the first Civil Service Commissioner, Baroness Stuart, Gisela Stuart, late of this parish, now gracing the red benches at the other end of the Palace of Varieties. Gisela, as always, you're welcome, and thank you so much for finding the time to come before the committee this morning. Now, you're almost 3 years into a 5-year term as the first Civil Service Commissioner. What has changed in that time in terms of your duties and the expectations, really, of what the Commission and the Commissioner is doing and should be doing? And if I could ask you just to sort of maybe then cast forward to think what the challenges you may see on the horizon and how you would like to sort of see the role conclude at the end of the 5 years, what the landscape might look like.
The Civil Service Commission, in essence, has got a very enduring duty, and that goes back to Northcote Trevelyan of ensuring that the best people are appointed into the civil service and that they're appointed by a process that is open and fair and that the appointment itself is done on merit. And I think we have benefited as a commission from the constitutional, from CRAC, the 2010 Act, which set us up on a statutory basis, which was a very enabling piece of legislation, and we also have the recruitment principle. So what has remained is this enduring duty. What has changed since I've become the first Civil Service Commissioner is the most obvious. It's a new government. And we haven't had a real change of government since 2010, because 2010 you had coalition, but you had a change of government. And on top of that, as in a sense all of you, apart from you, Chair, and me here, are a testament to, is a huge turnover of members of Parliament. And that meant that for the Commission, and the role as educator, as much as regulator, was probably more acute. From my point of view, what's been really important that the Commission itself is now in a very steady state. We have got full staffing complement. We have an organisational structure where one chief executive with 3 organisations. So it's Civil Service Commission, it's ACOPA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, and OCPA, the Office of Commissioner for Public Appointments. And that's a good efficiency. We've got 12 commissioners, as well as me as first Civil Service Commissioner, have got a good balance of background, both public sector and private sector. And what's equally important, we have link commissioners, specified link commissioners, one for Scotland and one for Wales. So I have interactions with the First Ministers. In 2010, the Act of Parliament also said that we should have a memorandum of understanding with our sponsoring department, and that memorandum should be renewed on a triennial basis. We're almost there to have a new framework agreement, and I'm sort of slightly disappointed that we aren't completely there yet, but it makes it clear the relationship between the sponsoring department, that we're not a business unit of the Cabinet Office. And I hope that looking ahead, 2 things are important. I think one, in terms of the Commission, that as we have the rotation and we've got a good balance, that the government will make appointments in due course in a timely fashion, given that we are all on 5-year non-renewable. But you had heard evidence from Kat Little, the Permanent Secretary of the Cabinet Office and Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service, and she was talking about the need for better data. HR data across the civil service, and I think that would help both the civil service to function better, but also would help us as a regulator.
The civil service is an amalgam. It has been described by some as the sort of blob, Sir Humphrey-like, who sits there as a way of trying to frustrate governments of all stripes from achieving their objectives. Others would describe it as the sort of Rolls-Royce of public administration. I'm not quite sure whether they were drawing or sitting in the tepid bath, which the Prime Minister spoke of some weeks ago. Has government, has Cabinet Office, has Number 10 shared with you as First Commissioner their vision of the civil service and how current and future recruitment can help them deliver that?
If you're a regulator, you have to make a decision how you wish to regulate. And we as a commission sort of feel very strongly, and my fellow commissioners, that success is that the whole system is as rule compliant as possible, that we educate whenever possible, that we audit if we find things as they should be. That is success. And with a new cabinet secretary, which of course is the other thing, not just new government, but also new yes. Cabinet secretary, they're currently going on a number of conversations going on across government. But I feel the role is for us as regulators to come in at the end and say, these are decisions you've reached and how do we facilitate that we deliver you the best. May I just say one other thing when you talked in relation to the civil service? I think it is really unfortunate that the only popularly attractive version people can see of the role of a civil servant is the Sir Humphrey image. Because I think as a profession, it's more than 500,000 people who really do fulfill some of the most diverse roles, and some of them really tough. And we probably should do more to recognise, their professionalism, but also just the variety of challenges they have to meet, and meet on a daily basis.
That was a very courageous answer, in the words of Sir Humphrey. You talked about those sort of conversations ongoing, and you're right, we've heard from Cat Little. Some, I think, degree of frustration at the siloisation of the civil service. Each department is effectively its own limited company, or PLC, for want of a better phrase, which some would see as an inhibitor to driving forward a mission-led, target-focused, cross-cutting government. What's your assessment of the urgency of the conversations which are being held in government? Because you and I know, we all know, that actually a 5-year term is actually quite a short thing when you're trying to turn around, if turning around is required, a very significant machine of, as you say, 500,000 people.
I think the urgency is one, driven by technology. I think it is important that government utilises as quickly as possible across government both the potential of artificial intelligence, but also just data gathering, which can give them comparable data across the Whitehall departments, but also I think across the nations. That's important too, so you can measure things. But there's a wider challenge, which is delivery, and I think if as we all do support democracy, then I think part of face of democracy is in delivery, which is visible to the voters, and therefore I think that's why a competent and able civil service is important to allow the government to deliver quickly. The world around us is changing very quickly, so I think it's not a question of whether government has a choice. I think it's governments across the democratic governments across the world.
And when filling those senior positions or making recommendations to fill who should be filling, are you sort of handed a skills gap audit that you're then sort of teed up to ascertain which of the candidates may best possess them to fill it?
So if looking ahead, if there's one thing which I would observe is that at the top level, at permanent secretary level and director general level, the skills management done by the Cabinet Office team and HR, I think, is a very good one. Where I think it could improve is that you've got more at director and deputy director level, so that you do your skills management at top level, which is currently very much supply driven, and move it more to be demand driven. But you're now touching on something which is always one of those dividing lines between the Commission and the HR function of the civil service. And I'm always very keen that as a regulator, we can hold up a mirror, but then have to say, and this is the HR function. when it comes to the appointment process, that's why a lot of effort goes into writing the job specifications, agreeing with the vacancy holder, which is the permanent, is very often the Secretary of State, of just what skills they're looking for, and that then the interviewing process is that you make the decision of whether the appointment is a merit, to what extent at the time they match those skills you've put in the job specifications. So a lot of effort has to go into getting that right, and then the rest will flow from that.
Thank you. Do you want to come in?
I was going to come in later on, I think, on that point.
In which case, I'll go to Richard quickly.
Just a brief question. How would we or the general public know if the Commission didn't exist?
I think for a short period, you probably wouldn't know, because interviews would still go on. But what would change over time is that independent member on that panel who oversees and has a view across Whitehall and departments outside Whitehall for the senior appointments, and therefore can make comparators of a given time. And what is always difficult to quantify, but we all know it exists, is if a group of people who will professionally work together, and you have working relationships, you've got falling outs, the minute an independent member chairs that panel, you introduce that element of a structure. And I think that's where really the merit of the Civil Service Commission is. And the second thing is, it's important that the Commission itself has a balance of skills. So successive governments have acknowledged that you will have a better civil service if people move in and out of the civil service, experience outside, and therefore I think the regulator itself has to have people who bring that mix to the table.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Baroness Stuart. It's very good to see you. In relation to the recent recruitment of the new Cabinet Secretary, could you outline in a bit more detail just what your role was when you became involved, and how you were involved in the actual recruitment process?
A few things to say at the outset. So my involvement there was in my capacity as the first Civil Service Commissioner. Not in the capacity of the Commission. The Cabinet Manual and the only guidance you have in terms of how a Cabinet Secretary should be appointed says the Cabinet Secretary is appointed by the Prime Minister on the advice of the retiring Cabinet Secretary and the first Civil Service Commissioner. And as that process started, I had conversations with Simon Case, the outgoing Cabinet Secretary, and Simon was of the view, and I agreed with him, that first of all, in line with modern recruitment practices, it is unusual for an outgoing office holder to play an active part in appointing their successor. And therefore, we discussed the job specification, we discussed the panel composition, which we would put to the Prime Minister. But after that, Simon Case's advice was apart from my role. My role then was to, having suggested the panel to the Prime Minister, to talk it through with the Prime Minister that he was content with the job description. The panel itself, if you look at it, was of diverse backgrounds. You had a former Cabinet Secretary, you had a former career civil servant who went into the private sector, you had the lead government, Ned, who is also has got a business background, and me chairing it. And we agreed, the Prime Minister agreed, and he didn't have to. You know, the Prime Minister's got great discretion as to how they appoint that I think for the first time we had a process which started with an agreed job advertisement which was published, a panel that would interview and very much go through a process almost analogous to a senior civil service appointment, complying with broad principles of the recruitment principles. And we ended up giving the Prime Minister a recommended shortlist of people who were appointable. And at that moment, the Prime Minister engaged again to meet the candidates, and I was present at all those meetings, as would be the case with Permanent Secretary 1. And then he made the decision. So what we found is a way forward, which was both showed a flexibility, but much greater transparency and openness. And from the Commission's point of view, I was grateful that the Prime Minister showed that confidence in the Commission and the Civil Service Commission to conduct that.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful. I'm going to come back to the recruitment principles later in the session. But in relation to the devolved governments, do you have a similar role in terms of the appointment of the Scottish Government's Permanent Secretary and the equivalent in the Welsh Government?
Yes, and indeed we are currently recruiting a new Permanent Secretary for the Scottish Government. So I'll be going up to Edinburgh in a fortnight's time. And on those occasions, so both Scotland and Wales have chosen to be part of the UK civil service. Northern Ireland has its own arrangements. And in those cases, for Permanent Secretary appointments, it's not the Prime Minister, but it's the First Minister who fulfills that role. So when the vacancy arose for the Permanent Secretary in Scotland, I had conversations with the First Minister as to the job description. The First Minister will see shortlisted candidates, and I will see all shortlisted candidates, and I'll be in the room for that, and he will be given the choice of appointable candidates.
Did your appointment come after the appointment of John Paul Marks as current Permanent Secretary? Were you involved in his recruitment?
No, I wasn't recruited. It was my predecessor, Rosie Glazebrook, who actually did that appointment.
I'm just thinking how you deal with or how you as a organisation learn lessons. And obviously there was a controversy in Scotland involving Leslie Evans and Alex Salmond's case. What was your takeaway and reflections coming into your role in terms of what happened in that particular case and what we could be doing better in terms of impartiality of the civil service at a senior level?
I think that's why those kind of appointments, like now with the Permanent Secretary, which is open to applicants all across the United Kingdom, the process is chaired by the Civil Service Commission. That is, I still think, your best safeguard. The other point to remember for the role of the civil service, if there are any complaints against the Civil Service Code, then that would come to us at the Civil Service Commission if there are questions about that. But I always think it's best when departments themselves deal with any pressures or problems occur, and from the Commission level we're here to assist, but I think these problems are best resolved in the Home Department.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. When was the decision taken that the role of Cabinet Secretary would be open competition rather than a Prime Ministerial appointment, and who made that decision?
That was a decision by the Prime Minister. As soon as the process started, he was quite clear in the conversation that it would be a process as open and as transparent as possible, and very much building on the previous one. My predecessors had made first steps towards making that process an open recruitment process. But at the same time, I think you do need to provide the flexibility that if circumstances demand, you could do it differently.
So what role did the Prime Minister then play in the recruitment process compared to previous recruitment processes of a Cabinet Secretary?
I think it was at the beginning, the job description agreeing and also agreeing a panel. You had an external panel and agreeing on that. And then the interviewing sessions at the end as a result of that recruitment. That was unusual.
Do you think that's the right level of Prime Ministerial involvement? You didn't feel it was too much or too little?
I think it was the right level, and as I said, he gave a lot of time, of his own time, to make sure it because it's such an ad hominem appointment. It is such an important decision for the Prime Minister of the day and the relationship of the Cabinet Secretary. The only thing I would sort of looking ahead is I do hope that we kind of do a bit of succession planning on Cabinet Secretaries, and probably think that the Cabinet Secretary in 10, 15 years' time is probably a Deputy Director in some department now. And and I think that openness of the process is good for the civil service as well.
And do you think it sets a good precedent doing it that way?
Yeah, I think it does.
Thank you, Chair.
Just before I begin, next colleague, you mentioned at the top of your remarks it was a new government coming in, and I welcome and applaud the Prime Minister's approach to this, and I hope it now sort of has embedded itself as something which can evolve and further develop, as you suggested. Do you know if he, and this may be tricky because they were figures of a different party, but does he take any soundings or ask any questions of prime ministerial predecessors? Because the current Prime Minister's experience of being Prime Minister and chairing the Cabinet was actually quite a short window of experience.
I wouldn't know, but I just as there is a group, a gathering of former Cabinet Secretaries,
yes.
I'd be very surprised if former Prime Ministers do not have a similar good working relationship
yes.
with each other.
Yes, usually sometimes they offer advice even when it's not requested. But there we are. But I mean, do you think that would be? Yes, I mean it can sort of happen behind the scenes, as it were. But that sort of audit of skills, because I think certainly it's been our impression that something which new ministers are alert to is just how different the doing of government is in 2024-25 than it was in 2009-2010, the last time they were in office. And I think that's come as quite a shock. So do you think it's an important principle to effectively sound out predecessor prime ministers to say, what skills did you think your cabinet secretary may have, and then you found that they were wanting? What skills do you think they may need, particularly because we'd gone through inflation, we'd gone through Ukraine, we'd gone through an international pandemic? A whole new set of skill demands had been placed on very senior civil servants.
Allow me to sort of tackle that from a sort of slightly different angle, and that is if you look at the job description of the Cabinet Secretary as it was published, and you look at the role, which is it's not just the Prime Minister's principal policy advisor, but you also the secretary to the entire cabinet. It's sort of it's a role that's often forgotten, and at the same time you are the head of the profession. You are the head of the civil service. I think it's one of the things that whoever you end up choosing as your cabinet secretary, the next step is a kind of reflection of what are the other roles which are supporting the cabinet secretary. And in that sense, I think the role of the permanent secretary in the cabinet office, who is also the chief operating officer of the civil service, Cat Little, is a really important one. And I would have thought and would have expected that once you had the appointment, there then becomes in saying, and what other support, where are the other sources of support which we need in order to fulfill this function, which by definition one person can't completely fulfill.
Yeah.
No, I'm fine. I'm done. Thank you.
All done.
Yeah.
I think in which case we go to John.
Thank you, Chairman. Just come back to the process to recruit or appoint the current Cabinet Secretary and the desirability of that process. Is there anything you could do or Parliament could do to enshrine that process more? I mean, just to avoid the scenario in the future of a future Prime Minister making a purely personal appointment. Is there some way of enshrining this process or making it more protected for the future?
At the risk of now sounding as a great advocate of precedent and flexibility, I think that it is sometimes it is not always true that just by creating legislative frameworks you can guarantee stability. And if I look at the Constitutional Reform Act, the CRAG, which set us up, and the reforming principles, it's a piece of legislation which is both clear in its purpose, but provides flexibility to respond when circumstances demand quick actions. And if you were to go back when Theresa May was Prime Minister and she did not run a competition to appoint Mark Sedwill, that was in response to circumstances where it was felt that that vacancy needed to be filled quickly. And I think a Prime Minister ought to have that flexibility when it is needed, because it does take some time. It requires several months of processes, and a Prime Minister may not always have the luxury to do that. And that's why I think the current statutory framework provides for both. It gives the option to run the full process. The only thing which I would do is, looking ahead, is just keep an eye on how the private sector recruits for such very senior positions. And whilst when you appoint a permanent secretary, you can do such things as staff engagement exercises, and get psychological feedback. You can't really do that for the cabinet secretary role, because at that moment, internal and external candidates sort of declare their hand, which isn't always the best thing. So using...
And that little bit, when you say declare their hand,
well,
what do you mean?
You couldn't really do a staff exercise with candidates for the cabinet secretary. Because small numbers of people applying. And I think you want to protect the confidentiality of HR processes, particularly when external candidates apply. I think it's really important that you don't put off candidates who may have been in the civil service, went out and want to come back in again. And you may want to use professional psychologists to do a bit additional assessment. But that, again, requires time.
So you're saying, on the one hand, we should be looking at what the private sector is doing, but there's some methods that they're deploying which might not be appropriate.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Luke Taylor.
We spoke about advice from previous Prime Ministers, whether that was involved in the appointment. Just a query about what role the outgoing Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, played in the appointment process.
So we at the outset, we discussed, Simon Case and I, we discussed what a potential job specification would look like. We discussed what an external panel composition would be appropriate. But the final word over agreeing that was then with the Prime Minister. And I then took charge of the process and chairing the panels. And Simon provided advice to the Prime Minister separate from what I did in terms of the panel.
Do you think that because the Simon Case standing down was so long telegraphed that his role in the replacement was more appropriate than, say, if a secretary was being replaced in a much more urgent basis, as it were?
No, I don't think so. I think so if you look at the cabinet manual, and it sort of says, the retiring cabinet secretary. So that advice role and just how active that is a choice of the circumstances. But the second one is the first Civil Service Commissioner's advice. And to me, what was important, that there had to be a process on which I could justify my advice. And on what basis does the first Civil Service Commissioner, particularly when, in my case, I wasn't a former permanent secretary, would arrive at decision, and therefore a panel with external candidates where we tested gave a good basis for that report. And Simon Case, as former head of the Civil Service, would provide a different dimension, which would directly go to the Prime Minister.
Anything else, Mr. Chair?
And are you content that that should be the case in the future? Would that role be more formalised? I think in the private sector you'd have an exit interview when a employee was leaving an organisation. You might kind of take feedback from them into shaping the role, changing the role, assessing the suitability of future employees. Do you think that process should be more formalised, or is it very much a case-by-case basis, as it were?
I think you're now tempting me into HR decisions within government, which is probably not the regulator's task. But government made two significant decisions in that context. One is the Prime Minister decided that the role of Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service would remain in one function, which historically we've seen there have been attempts to separate it at some stage. And similarly, the fact that the Cabinet Office's Permanent Secretary is the Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service also was a fairly recent innovation. And that gives you an indication that the government made some decisions to keep those structures.
Can I just take you back to something that you've just said in reply to Mr. Taylor, Lady Stuart? Which was, and in asking this question, I'm not casting aspersions on Simon Case at all. But you're the first Civil Service Commissioner. You have your panel. You're following the rules and the rubric. You're conducting a process for which you are ultimately accountable. The Cabinet Secretary outgoing plays a part in shaping and sculpting the job description, but then of course has ready access to the ear of the Prime Minister. And it could be in circumstances where the person that, say, for example, that the Commission is recommending to the Prime Minister to be suitable for appointment has crossed swords with the outgoing Cabinet Secretary on a previous occasion, may have got the best of the outgoing Cabinet Secretary in a certain scenario, and they sit very quietly in the confines of the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's study, unaccountably dripping poison or honeyed words for their potential friend in a process which could render all the professionally scrutinisable work which the Commission is doing utterly worthless. In a culture which now seeks transparency, openness, accountability, how does one frame that in order to reduce that opportunity?
Then,
as I say, I'm not attributing that
So
at all to
at the end of the interviewing stage, in front of the panel, and it's a panel with diverse backgrounds, we issued a report which gave the Prime Minister a choice of a diverse range of candidates where we said they were appointable. There wasn't a merit order. And the report would outline the candidates' strengths and weaknesses. And then the Prime Minister would see all those candidates and will arrive at and ask them questions, arrive at his own decisions, and then goes away and reflects and makes up the final decision. And I think in politics we all know and have experienced hearing voices to make this case and make the other case, and at the end of it, I think it's part of the skill of and the duty of, that's the whole point of politicians, that then, having listened to all sides, you arrive at your own decision. And I think what this process has allowed this Prime Minister to do is have a good set of choices. He went through the effort and he arrived at his decision. I think the Cabinet Secretary, whoever it is, will be one of the voices he or she will hear.
Is there any merit in codifying, formalising how an outgoing Cabinet Secretary discusses the vacancy with the Prime Minister of the day?
I hope I'm not sort of okay. I think a good cabinet secretary is a professional civil servant at the top of their career, and they have, in my experience, civil servants actually have a very developed sense of what their duties are and the principles of honesty, integrity, and their impartiality. And I would have thought that that is a much stronger safeguard, a professional culture of their conduct, and being reminded of that, rather than trying to codify a process which has to be a process that's sufficiently flexible to respond to needs.
Thank you. Marcus Campbell-Sayles.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think you're looking to wrap up this section on this, so now might be a good time to ask the question about what changes you'd like to see in the future appointment of cabinet secretaries. You've touched upon various things, but in terms of where the process might be reformed moving forward, how do you see things going?
I think cabinet secretary in particular, and just generally also with the top jobs, I think we need to keep looking at how the private sector does it in terms of psychological assessments and just testing and moving in and out. I think that is one of the really important things, that this notion of that your career structure from beginning to end just within the public sector is, I wouldn't say that the private sector is best or the public sector is best, but I think the interaction of learning I think be really important. And for example, I personally would have thought that any top role should have at some stage have either been in one of the devolved administrations or had some exposure to the very large local authorities. And that's why I think the whole move of some of the big functions out of London are really important. So it's just keep checking whether the processes we have are still in line with generally HR in the wider world is probably the most important one from my viewpoint.
And is the role of the Civil Service Commissioner, and is it being used correctly here? Is there any lessons to be learned?
Of the first, yeah, I mean, it is interesting that I think the first Civil Service Commissioner, and I draw this distinction very deliberately from the Commission, because the first Civil Service Commissioner is the default position for chairing all the interviewing panels for permanent secretaries. I think it gives them...
I'm new to this.
Yeah.
I see that there's a distinction in that role that gets played in that appointment, but within the organisation, is that a real distinction? Is there not a conflict later down the line if there are complaints being handled about roles, and the first commissioner has been involved at that point? Sorry to...
No.
I understand that relationship a bit better and how that's managed within your organisation.
So you've got 12 commissioners, and for most of the time it is it's equals in terms of chairing interviewing panels for whether it's deputy directors or director generals. The recruitment principles actually say that there is a presumption that for permanent secretaries, it's the first Civil Service Commissioner who chairs that competition. They can delegate the role, and I mean, for example, I recused myself from chairing the Cabinet Office permanent secretary because before I became the first Civil Service Commissioner, I was the lead NED in the Cabinet Office, and when I came in front of the of PACAC, I actually said that I would recuse myself for 2 years, as would be the normal practice. So it can be done by others, but there are sort of very rare occasions where it is the office of where it's the first Civil Service Commissioner specifically. But I haven't come across anywhere where it would be a conflict of interest. Can you think of an example where that might arise?
Maybe next time.
Maybe I should watch out for it, but I have not yet come across it. But I'm not saying...
I just want to ask a quick question, differential between theory and practice. In theory, anybody can apply for these posts. In practice, only somebody from within the civil service is going to get them. Is that...
You mean the Cabinet Secretary post?
Yeah. The system is, this is pejorative, but is stacked in favour of internal appointments rather than applicants from overseas, applicants from the private sector, charitable sector, local government sector, the devolved sector.
Which is why I say if you want real transparency, if you really want that greater movability in and out, it's actually at a lower level. You want to be deputy director, director levels, grade 6s, where you really, I think you want people to move in and out. The key thing for me is, first of all, the job specification for the cabinet secretary did not specify a background in the civil service. That wasn't one of the essential criteria. Having said that, given that it's also the head of the profession, I would find it most unusual in any profession that you would have the head of a profession someone who didn't have experience in that profession itself.
Does that not then speak to an argument that the Cabinet Secretary should not necessarily be head of the Home Civil Service? Because if the organisation needs radical drive, reform, fresh set of eyes from any of those other non-civil service sectors that I've mentioned, because there is that expectation that you're the head of the professional service and therefore you have to have some experience from within it. Is there any merit in formally divorcing those things? Cabinet Secretary does the job of the Cabinet Secretary. The head of the civil service does the job of the head of the civil service. And given that those two jobs are enormously demanding, speaking back to the point that you made, that nobody exists with the full complement of skills required to discharge at a level of excellence across the whole piece, might help, might it not?
It's a very seductive argument, and it has been tried, and turned out not to be, after having tried to separate that. And I was very attractive to that model. Before, 2 years ago, I would have said, brilliant idea, yes, I think this is a right way of going about it. What I have observed is that if you, in order to have the authority which you carry as head of the civil service, you actually do require regular access to the Prime Minister. And I think you also require an understanding on managing and advising the whole of the cabinet, and therefore.
Well, they could sit in cabinet. They could attend cabinet. It doesn't preclude them.
In what role?
Because I take your point entirely.
In what role?
As head of the civil service.
And what would they contribute at that moment to a cabinet meeting?
Forgive me if I misheard you. I thought you said that it was important that they.
Yeah, and that's why I think the cabinet secretary, as both being the secretary to the cabinet and the head of the civil service in one role, is at the cabinet, and that's why I think what's
but
then.
Two people could be.
I think we. Okay, I'm not saying. I'm just saying my
times,
inclination is
we've
now.
had more ministers of state attending cabinet than you and I probably had hot cooked lunches. Cabinet is not a fixed thing, apart from the number of cabinet secretaries. It's not a fixed thing. And given the fact that just the whole the process of governance is now more complex.
I mean, it has been tried, the separation of head of the civil service and cabinet secretary in two figures has been tried in the recent past, and the fact that it has not been repeated leads me to believe that it was not deemed to be successful. And looking at it now, I think what is underestimated in my view is how important that relationship between the cabinet secretary and the permanent secretary in the cabinet office and chief operating officer, that those two together, and that their relationship gives you the maximum of prime ministerial involvement, making sure you serve the government, and inspiring and dealing with the civil service.
I understand and see the foundations of it. But speaking back to a point that we were discussing earlier in this session, which is the de facto siloisation of the civil service, and that each cabinet secretary is effectively the CEO, managing director, etc. The head of the civil service, as we understand it, can urge permanent secretaries, can nudge permanent secretaries, can chivvy permanent secretaries. They can't tell.
But it's the cabinet secretary at the end of the day will do the performance review of the individual permanent secretaries. And I think the senior leadership committee and there are a whole lot of levers and mechanisms by which the cabinet secretary can structure and influence and ensure that his cadre of permanent secretaries is performing well. I'm not sure whether that a fragmentation at the top of the roles gives you greater coherence further down. I think there's much more coherence across.
I mean, that may be the case, but you may get actual better outcomes if you have two people focused on very distinct channels of work. Whereas at the moment we have one person doing effectively two very, very demanding and challenging jobs in an international scenario, which doesn't suggest international affairs and governance challenges are going to get any easier or any quieter anytime soon.
That's why I think the team which they surround themselves with is what's so important, what's underneath there. But I do think, as I say, I've kind of moved away from thinking that the sort of the division is the answer. I think it's much more. You have the cabinet secretary, and then you look who you effectively almost work with, whether they almost become their deputies, and then you need your senior leadership committee and the most senior of your permanent secretaries who support you in those tasks, and that's the team where you will deliver across government.
Okay. I don't think I'm going to persuade you on this one.
No,
but if you think of an individual government department, you have the Secretary of State, who is the political lead, and the permanent secretary, who is the lead deliverer and the lead professional. So we separate the two roles at departmental level, and yet combine them in the role of cabinet secretary when it comes to that.
Because just like the role of the Prime Minister, there comes at some stage where you reach the top of the pyramid. And I think if you've got a twin peak, I don't think that ultimately delivers you, because I think there has to be one final stop where the buck stops, and you have the delegation at a lower level.
One presumes the buck stops with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and the Cabinet Secretary. I think the two together, that's why that relationship is so absolutely important. And that's why I think it is right that the Prime Minister at the end of the day has the final say as to who they appoint as their Cabinet Secretary. But it's one is the permanent civil service, and the other one is the political control, and the political control trumps, forgive the word, the permanent civil service ones.
The buck stops with the Prime Minister?
Yeah.
Not with the Cabinet Secretary?
The buck stops with both of them, but the civil service, the permanent civil service buck stops with the cabinet secretary.
Right.
And then you've got the Prime Minister as the head of the government.
Yes. We may just have alighted on a governance problem, which may point to all sorts of other things. Luke, were you trying to catch my eye?
I was.
Going to bring in Sam.
I mean, anecdotally, or it could be argued that the role does seem to have quite a heavy toll on the bearer. And does that come into, first of all, the workload of having both those hats to wear, and also the potential single point of failure, as it were, if that person is incapacitated or signed off sick for a while? Does that lead to any conclusions in the wisdom of all of that responsibility being on one pair of shoulders?
You are now seriously leading me astray into areas where probably, if you had former cabinet secretaries to give evidence, who have much more of a first-hand experience of what the lived experience of that role is, and how they feel, how you can handle it and how you respond to it.
Those questions not part of the appointment procedure?
The part of the appointment procedure was that we kind of really tested in terms of the questions of how is their personal resilience, how do they deal with stress, what are their responses to when you have those demands, how do they end up prioritising. That would be a set of questions you probably have at most of those top rows, but with that one in specifically, that was an area of questioning.
And did any of them ask you that question? How are we expected to, or I'm a bit worried about?
No.
That's slightly worrying.
It's very worrying.
Sam Carling.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move on a little bit to talk about the recruitment principles and perhaps some of the exceptions to them. So first of all, the recruitment principles, I think, were published in 2018. Are you confident that they're still up to date? They need to be updated?
Yeah, so I come back to the beauty of the legislation which governs us, which says there shall be recruitment principles, but it doesn't specify what they say. And I recommend them. I find them really quite extraordinary, that if you read them for every kind of eventuality, it's very thoughtful. So this is the culmination of the institutional experience of which goes over 100 years of the kind of things which might happen. In 2018, it was very much the review of that was responding to a particular initiative which was dealing with apprentices going forward into employment. Part of things which I hope that we as a commission can do, and I want to do in the sort of the last 2 odd years of my term, is that we review a number of our documents and just see whether and policies and see whether it's still at the most appropriate, or whether we could bring changes to really just align to what is the practice.
Thank you. And could you outline a little bit more about the role of the Civil Service Commission in relation to appointments that are made an exception to the recruitment principles?
Yeah, so the thinking behind that process, we are governed by that recruitment is open and fair and based on merit, but there's also recognition that there are either sometimes urgent needs of the government, or very, very specialist skills, or just very special circumstances from you need to recruit a whole lot of people to deal with the census, so you have got a bulk recruitment, or you deal with nuclear submarines, or you deal with very sensitive inquiries where you've got non-civil servants having been brought in, and you extend that for a period. So the principle of exceptions, which have to be exceptional, is a very long established principle, and it helps the civil service to operate. And then at the level of, and again it's in the recruitment principles, the various exceptions for senior civil servants, for majority of those, it requires permission from the Civil Service Commission, but a lot of it is delegated to the departments themselves. And what we did this summer was we looked at both those processes. We looked at our own processes, and then we did an audit of how the delegation works within departments when they use the exceptions. And we being largely satisfied with the process as it was. The only change which we made, and the committee may want to look at that, is that up to now we've always in our annual report published the exceptions which we granted. We're now doing that on a monthly basis on our website because I think that's in greater transparency is always a good thing when you can achieve it.
Sure. So there was quite a lot of media interest quite early on to the new government's term around a few particular appointments that were made under the exceptions. Did the Civil Service Commission have any particular interest in those, or did you have any input into those processes?
Well, we kind of looked at the numbers after the change of government, and there wasn't a spike in numbers of applications, and that's why we did the review of the processes, and as to whether our decision is very much fact driven. Is this either a very specialist skill? Is there some urgency? Is it a very short-term appointment? And if the facts match that we will grant an exception, then we do that. And as I said, we then also looked at the delegation. And the one change where we also looked at when the forms get filled in by departments, we said to departments that you should make it clear that there is the conflicts of interests and all those things have to be handled by the department itself, and that there is an expectation that is dealt with, not just that it may be. So I think departments themselves looked at their forms, we looked at ours, and as I said, we were largely satisfied that the process works well.
That's really helpful. And just to really confirm there, so you're saying that the number of those appointments being made under the new government is not significantly different from the previous government?
No, there wasn't a spike in the numbers.
Okay, brilliant. And on a sort of somewhat related note to that, could you tell us a bit more about what role or influence the Civil Service Commission has when the government perhaps wants to remove a permanent secretary in unusual circumstances?
The Civil Service Commission has got no role in that.
Okay, right. Do you think that's wise? Should it have a role in regulating that?
Depends on what you mean by removal.
So there were a number of cases sort of toward the end of the previous government where certain permanent secretaries were taken away or sort of encouraged to step down, and there was a lot of media interest in that.
I'm sure they were taken away. That sounds rather sort of...
Apologies. That's why I changed my phrasing.
And now start
taken away, never to be seen again, sort of thing.
Encouraged to step down.
And I now recall that I gave evidence to House of Lords Committee on the on that. No, I mean that's really that is purely an HR function. I mean, what we regulate is we regulate the entry into the civil service. There is an argument to be made that if we want to attract external talent at the senior level who want to have that movement, whether the Civil Service Commission should also regulate the exit in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of what at the moment the business appointments departments does, so that you've got clarity at the point of entry of what the rules of the exit will be. I think there's an argument to be made that maybe the Civil Service Commission should have a single point. But in terms of contracts not being renewed, that's an HR function.
Thank you very
much. Stuart, civil services prides itself on its political neutrality. But we don't have the American system, nor do I think anybody would actually want to see the American system. But we've had the rise over several governments over many years of the special advisor, who is often seen as an adjunct to the Secretary of State of the ministerial team, as the sort of bridge between the two and the sort of political bit, in inverted commas, of the sort of quasi-civil service. It's always struck me that it's political neutrality is important, but political antennae, political understanding, political empathy of what's going on around when is actually quite a key component of the civil service, particularly at the senior levels. Do you share that view? It doesn't make them party political, but should there be a sort of broader political delivery team in government departments led by a Director General or whoever, driving that as a way of improving overall the operational ability of the civil service?
I would use the word impartiality rather than neutrality. And the impartiality is something that every civil servant at any given moment has as their function to implement the policies of the government of the day. And for that, they have to have small p political antennae. They need to understand how Parliament works. They need to understand how the whole system works, how you bring people along. But that does not make them party political.
Yeah, quite.
And I think that nevertheless, the party politician also wants to have a party politics, and it's part of the problem of political parties in government renewing their party political mandate whilst they're in government. So I accept the role of the special advisor, which has the party political interest at heart. But from the Civil Service Commission's point of view, it's the one thing in the Constitutional Reform Act which is absolutely clear, and that's a red line, and that says special advisors cannot play any role in the appointment of a civil servant. And I think there's a clear dividing line. You either are a civil servant or you're not a civil servant. And therefore, special advisors, that's a decision for the government. Civil Service Commission does not get involved there. And what's more, they do not get involved in the work of appointing civil servants.
Marcus.
Where we've seen the use of exceptions for appointments to civil service roles, is there an argument that some of these should have been SPAD or PAD appointments instead? And does the Commission have any role in deciding whether these should be mainstream civil service roles or whether they should be in that different category?
No, we don't get involved in that decision at all. I mean, how many special advisors you have or policy advisors, which are, that is a decision for the government of the day. What we regulate is when they become civil servants, and at that moment when in the exceptions process become civil servants, we remind them in their appointments letter that they're bound by the Civil Service Code, and that includes the impartiality. So where they draw that line in terms of both numbers and individuals, that's a decision for the government.
Are you convinced that there is that check to see whether the purpose of that role is suitable for a civil service role, and or whether there is an attempt to move somebody potentially from a party political position into a civil service role?
So as a former politician, I think in a democracy, the fact that you have been politically active does not bar you for any future civil service roles. What matters is how you conduct yourself in that role, and that you follow the very strict guidelines of impartiality and serving the government of the day. So I think that it's always up to every particular panel or the decisions whether you bring people in. If there's a political background, that kind of due diligence, that kind of that you resolve conflicts of interest, or that has to be done by the recruiting department. And we have got an expectation that they handle that and deal with it. Whereas when it comes to the Civil Service Commission for sign-off, we look at the facts of what the reason given for why it requires that appointment, and the facts of that appointment, if those two match, then it can be done.
Many members of the public would struggle with that acceptance of people from a party political background going then into impartial civil service roles. Does that matter, that there may be people outside who perceive it that way?
Well, I think these are always the moments where it is incumbent on us, whether it's on the civil service side or the politicians, to actually respect those dividing lines, and it's through your conduct. It's always through your conduct that you prove your impartiality. But I think it would be a sad day when, and I say this in a room full of politicians, where in a democracy, the fact that you've been a democratically elected politician would be deemed as not making you suitable to hold responsible positions after that. That would be sad.
Some people just accept that.
Anything further?
I'm done there. Thank you, Chair.
John.
Sorry, thanks, Stuart. I mean, just thinking about what's happening across the Atlantic just now in America with new President Trump and the 4,000 odd appointments that he has to make, or any new president makes. I mean, do you see any merit in that type of system where incoming government has such control and power of all the sort of middle management and senior management, and it's not, the rules just don't seem to be the same? Does that enhance the power and ability of the president or a government to make decisions, or is there nothing that you see attractive in that at all?
I'd almost sort of say in the one extreme, the most extreme separation of power with its safeguards, and then we've got sort of the British system, and if I sort of draw back on my sort of continental European, my country of birth is one where you, broadly speaking, have got coalition governments. It's very rare that even one party is in power. I don't think there's a perfect system. What always matters is that you've got checks and balances, that you have got constraints, that power and authority is always checked in some ways, and that you're predictable, that people actually know on what basis decisions are being made. And one of the strengths of our system is that we've got two strands. One is a institutional memory, which is very much within a permanent impartial civil service, and then you've got a party political system that by and large tends to deliver functioning majorities, which allows you for decisions to be made. And within that, you have rules, and I just find that as a civil service commission, it's the clarity of our rules of how the civil servants are appointed to serve the elected politicians of the day, but with true flexibility if circumstances demand quick actions, to be an enabling regulator. I find that a really good system.
These appointments are always inclined to happen at the start of a new government. They're at the height of their powers. Civil service uncertainty exists about how their new ministers and others are going to settle in and issues they're going to take on, so on and so forth. The public, I think, has a legitimate worry that, or a legitimate expectation that positions which get paid by taxpayers' money are advertised and can be competitively applied for. Some appointments seem rather niche, bespoke. There's no advertisement. Somebody is appointed to do them. They may then exercise entire impartiality and never go anywhere near the boundaries of the acceptable operational techniques and tactics of a civil servant. But all of these appointments should be not within the gift of one person on a non-competitive appointment, surely. And we did have some instances at the start of this government of friend X gets appointed to do newly created job with no audit trail of advert, interview, appointment.
I mean, if you look at the exceptions, sometimes it's either for very short-term appointments where it's 3-4 months and it's in order to do a very specific job. You've then sort of other exceptions, for example, when you bring in someone to when you're planning machinery of government changes and you almost bring in an expert and part of their job is to then advise you on how you bring those machinery of government exchanges in. So I think, and in other areas, I mean, I mentioned earlier, particularly any of the positions to do with nuclear submarines these days, it's such a small pool of people who would have the expertise to do that. That I have not, I mean, if you tell me otherwise, but I have not seen any of those big appointments where I would have thought that the process, because applying for an exception is also a process which gets checked against the facts, that I would not be satisfied with that. So you either go through open and fair competition, yes, or you go through exceptions, but then there's still a process by which you check against the fact whether you grant that exception or not.
And forgive my ignorance on this. So it's a huge gap in my knowledge for which I crave your forgiveness. A temporary appointment to fulfil a machinery of government type task, or there's somebody in industry and business who's got a particular bit of expertise. They're appointed through the exception route. It's a task and finish.
Yep.
What restrictions are placed on them, having worked then, albeit on a temporary basis, within the civil service, at the heart of government, etc., to them going back with that accrued knowledge, an increased Rolodex of contacts, so on and so forth, going back to their business? What, if any, restraints exist on those who've been appointed by exception?
They would go through exactly the same process of the advisory committee on business interests on there. It's that exit process which currently we don't control. Okay. There wouldn't be any difference on the appointment.
But that's not discretionary, that's mandatory.
That's mandatory, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, are we coming back to you, or are we going to...
I'm good.
So you're done, thank you. Peter.
Thank you. I mean, it builds on that previous point that last year there were a number of appointments made, 3 in particular, at the Director General, Director and Deputy Director level. Exceptions from the recruitment principles are typically only allowed in those cases of temporary appointments. In these particular cases, and I'm happy to give you the names of the people involved, was that the case as part of that, the process through which they were appointed, that they were temporary, or what was the justification for those recruitment principles not being used? They were Emily Middleton as Director General, who previously had been working for Peter Carl, Ian Caulfield as Director, who had previously been donating to Labour Members of Parliament, and Jess Sargent as Deputy Director, who had previously worked for a number of Labour MPs and organisations.
So with all of those appointments, you would have had them either be temporary because it's very, very short period, or the specialist skills. As I said earlier, when you've got whether you had done political donations or all of those things, that's the kind of due process which we expect the departments to deal with conflicts of interest, deals with any ethical matters. When it comes to us, it's a question of the justification of, if the job is just for 4 months, then it becomes a temporary appointment. If it's machinery of government, that's on that appointment or temporary.
So in the case of each of these 3 roles, if they were a permanent appointment, we would expect them to have a unique set of skills that could not have been found through open recruitment.
I'm not sure it's right in this context to actually go into the details of individual HR matters. But
I appreciate that, but what we're trying to get at is how effectively the rules are being applied as these roles are being filled. And if there appear to be exceptions which have been discussed in the public domain quite extensively, that would raise questions as to how effective the recruitment principles were being applied.
Yeah, and that's why we did the review both as it comes into the ones which the Commission has to sign off and how it's being delegated. And when I think you quite rightly say, how can you be satisfied that the rules are being applied properly? we, for the delegated ones, for example, we do audits, we do pick out individual cases, we check to satisfy ourselves that all these exceptions are being applied properly. And as a result of the review which we did in the summer, we on our part said we're going to publish more quickly on a monthly basis those which we grant. So if anybody is concerned, it then is a matter of public record who has just been appointed on what exception. And in terms of the delegation, our auditing process regularly goes through that. And if we find anything which we think isn't quite right, we can actually do further deep dives. And we also changed some of the forms to sort of just make sure there's an expectation that any potential conflicts of interest and things are dealt with in departments. But I think the best thing we could do, having been largely satisfied with the process, is to publish on a monthly basis on our website those appointments and the reasons for the exception being used, being published almost very quickly, and then it's in the public domain.
In the event that someone has been appointed temporarily and a decision is taken to extend that or to potentially turn it into a permanent role, what role will the Commission play in either permitting or denying that change?
Well, they have to come to us if they want an extension, or if they want a new one within 12 months, then they have to come and get our permission. Or if they want to have an extension beyond 2 years, then it again has to come to us. And there are occasions when, for example, if you're a specialist in victim protection in an ongoing inquiry, which goes beyond the 2, 3, 4 years, then you extend that because that role is a very sensitive role. It requires you to have that experience, and then we will extend it. But it always has to come back to us and has to be justified. And we make the decision by looking at the facts, but also it's an executive decision largely by the team in the Civil Service Commission who will have experience in handling those processes, and that gives you a consistency on the basis of decision making, which certainly I makes me feel confident in that the process is handled properly.
Building on this, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has recently set out his vision, his intention to recruit more people in on a temporary basis into the civil service, particularly into data and software-based roles. I think the number 10 Innovation Fellows Programme being the main source of it. While these are typically going to be roles well below what the Commission would typically look at, given your role in ensuring that recruitment principles are consistently applied across civil service appointments, are there any concerns that this broadening out of the civil service to include a large new tranche of people who are appointed on a temporary basis may well be weakening the recruitment principles in their application in the civil service?
It doesn't worry me. AI, digital in particular, and nuclear is another area where we know that there are real shortages of skills, and where the civil service competes with the private sector in terms of getting those skills in. So as a regulator, I think it's important that we actually provide a framework which, if you require temporary for the skills to be brought in, or sometimes more long-term, to allow the civil service to build up its own skills, we very much want to be an enabler to allow government to be as effective as possible. And we have regular conversations with departments of when they do want to bring in temporary staff as to what is the best way of doing it, what's the best way of framing it. And we always have that before we grant authority. I've in the years I've been doing this, I have not detected a desire on behalf of departments to evade rules. They actually do want to be as rule compliant as possible. And I think it's our role to be that educator, regulator. And I think the rules as they are at the moment are flexible enough to accommodate most requirements of government.
Thank you.
There's a system that could be played.
Forgive me, could you say that again?
There's a system that could be played. I'm going to make a temporary appointment. It will last 2 years. Oh, the project has gone a little longer. We haven't made the progress we wanted to. We want to reappoint them on another temporary contract for 2 years. Well, that's the lion's share of a parliament. is there a finite point where renewals of temporaries just somebody would say no? And if so, who?
We can say no. And we do say no. But that's why I think, in my experience, that it's a very respectful relationship. And I think people, in my experience, people come and ask for advice of how to best accommodate a particular requirement. I have not seen evidence of the system being played as you suggest, but that doesn't mean theoretically.
Yes. And
I'm not sure what's the incentive. I would almost turn it around and say, what is the incentive? Because I would put the counter argument of if anybody who takes a position within the civil service who's been appointed by open and fair competition and is appointed on merit actually makes them a much stronger position. It gives them much greater credibility and makes it easier for them to do the job.
The motivation, I'm always quite keen that we sort of future-proof. And, I think we all know that Western democracies, and particularly those without a written constitution, for example, work basically on practitioners, irrespective of party, having a basic appreciation of, an understanding of, and a commitment to play by a set of common rules. Now, you could call that the sort of good chaps ethos if you wished. But with the sort of rise of populism, disruptors, challenges to the institutions, a lack of respect generally for the institutions, and impatience of how things have always worked. Do we do enough? Does the Commission do? Do the relevant people do? Are they doing enough sort of future proofing to guard against the malign, rather than just presuming it will always be a good chap who knows where the boundaries are?
I think the answer to your concerns, which are legitimate ones, I think is then always transparency, predictability and accountability. So that you know at the outset what the rules are which are going to be applied, you know who is enforcing those rules, and then the results of what you do gets published. And I think so if I go to the appointment by exceptions, I think it's a good step that we ended up doing it on a monthly basis, because then it's published and you know who it is and you know on book, and it's kind of live data rather than being told a year later. So rather than future proofing, because the future is always a little slightly tricky, I think it is predictability, transparency, and clarity over who makes what decisions. And then you can trace it back to who's responsible for what.
Yes. It's the people who always go, yeah, okay, you've published, it's all transparent, etc., but I'm in charge, you can't stop me, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't really care about convention. I'm a disruptor, and I wear that as a badge of honour. It's the, and so? It is potentially a problem, isn't it?
No, I genuinely don't think it is a problem within the civil service. I think.
No, I'm not saying it's necessarily a problem within the civil service. It's a problem within politicians.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But as the first civil service commissioner and the regulator for the civil service, I have confidence in the professionalism and the processes by which they're appointed, and I think it's the transparency which is the important thing.
Lieutenant.
Thank you. So just on to governance now. So the Commission's MOU with Cabinet Office was agreed in 2010 and was due for review in 2013. When you appeared before this committee in 2023, this review had still not taken place. Has that occurred yet?
We are so close to having this document with you that I'm actually really disappointed that I can't sit here and say, yes, we've done it. It is written, it is in the very final draft stages, and it just needs the final nod. But the key things, which I was keen on the framework agreement, as they call it now, was that recognition that we are not a business unit of the Cabinet Office, and also the new framework, when you finally get over the hurdle, and next time I'm in front of you, I definitely will hold a copy of it in my hand. It makes a whole number of things much clearer in terms of the relationship with our sponsoring department. And I have an expectation that to have it renewed on a triennial basis will not just be an aspiration, but it will be done.
How does that become more stringently imposed?
I think this is when you just have to keep pushing those processes. And I think genuinely across government there has been a push over the last few years to renew a lot of those framework agreements with ALBs and sponsoring departments, and a greater awareness of just how important they are. So I'd actually quite honestly think that probably this committee could have quite an important role in ensuring that that's being done, not just with an individual framework agreement, but generally with framework agreements of ALBs.
I think others have questions then about how that may have changed, so I'll...
Marcus, you've indicated, and then I'm going to go to Richard. Sam, are you coming in on? You're fine on this.
After Richard, I think.
After Richard, thank you. Marcus.
Get a better understanding this issue around being perceived as a business unit of the Cabinet Office. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that entailed and what issues that was causing the Commissioner?
If you want to ensure the independence of a regulator, then there are certain things which you require, and part of it is that you know what your budget is, that you can decide your grades of staffing levels, and so the most obvious one is if Cabinet Office says we need to save money across the Cabinet Office, and each department needs to find 7% savings. If you're a small regulator, you should not be part of that kind of approach to business units. You'd say, this is our budget, and we're not a business unit, and therefore, that if we want to cross the departments a kind of savings, you're not affected by that. So the importance of not being a business unit, I think, is the importance of making sure that your regulator is independent and can function as an independent regulator. And that requires the two things from my point of view. One is timely appointments to vacancies by the sponsoring department. And the second one is that you've got a predictable, defined budget as you start off, and you're not subject to the vagaries of top slicing.
Sure.
Richard.
Are there any significant changes to the role of the Commission that you've been under discussion with the Cabinet Office? And if so, might they be incorporated into a new memorandum?
The memorandum as it stands, and as I say, it is literally the key things for me there was recognition and spelling out that we're not a business unit, and also this understanding that timely appointments are being made. I know the government may want to have some changes, and our statutory framework allows us to take on additional tasks, because whilst it defines the role of the Civil Service Commission, it also has a line which says that, and the Commission may undertake tasks which it is asked to and agrees to, and that's why I sort of mentioned to you that I think I would welcome a conversation about to what extent we don't just regulate entry into the civil service, but also the exit of the civil service. But that be really the only area where I think it's a main discussion point.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything that's currently outside of your remit that you would like to bring into your remit?
I mean, the statute exempts two areas, and one of them is the diplomatic service, and the other one is national security. And if others would want us to look into that, be very open to those discussions.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sam.
Very much. So just on a similar note, I guess, just around the general functioning of the regulator, I think so you have about 20 staff at the moment and 12 commissioners, I think you mentioned earlier. Do you think that's the correct staffing levels? Is that working?
Now, this is where I need to follow my instructions.
This one I prepared earlier.
The one that has been prepared for me earlier, and we've got this structure where one chief executive is the chief executive of 3 organisations, and I think there are some very useful economies of scale. That you have back office functions which go across departments, but at the same time, I think you have to be able to ensure that the independence of those 3 functions is maintained. So at the moment, we've got, for the first time, we have all the vacancies filled, and there's 32 members of staff, and this is the bit which I thought was important. So 12 members of staff are allocated to the Commission, 10 are allocated to ACOBA, 3 to OCPA, and then we've got 6 to the corporate service team, and then 1 chief executive. And I think that, to me, is a good structure where you... Because coming back to this notion of how do you ensure that the regulator is independent and remains independent, it requires a certain element of institutional resilience. And I think this allows us to have a cohesion in terms of the people who are together, but at the same time a size which makes it much more resilient.
And do you find that the budget you have available is sufficient to carry out your work?
Of course, we always would like more, but I think it's a question of always that tension of what roles you fulfill. And broadly speaking, the budget allocation does allow us to fulfill our role. However, I do think that in terms of digital transformation, there is something where we really need to look at how can we make ourselves more effective, or if they want us to undertake any extra tasks, to what extent that would require extra funding.
Okay, thank you.
I think the final question from me, which is hopefully a shortish one, terms of service of the majority of commissioners are due to end within the next 2 years. You've outlined, and I think the committee appreciates the important work that the Commission does and its usefulness. What steps do you take, or government takes, to find new commissioners to ensure that they're selected in good time and that there's a seamless transfer between outgoing and incoming?
I mean, that's why I sort of stressed in the framework agreement that almost part of it is the expectation that vacancies are being filled in a timely manner. What we've got at the moment is, I think, we've got a good balance between former civil servant and people who've got experience in the private sector or the NHS. We've got a good link commissioner for Scotland and Wales, which was an important thing. We've got 3 tranches of appointments. So that means that as their terms of office come to an end, and it's 5 years non-renewable, always acknowledging that from advertising the role to filling it and having done the induction, you should really allow a year. I think that we've given the sponsoring department a good set on which they can ensure institutional continuity on the current arrangements, as long as the positions are filled in a timely manner.
It still makes sense that they're non-renewable. Did it ever make sense?
You know, when I started this, if you'd asked me whether it makes sense, I would have sort of slightly shrugged and said, well, maybe it should be renewable. I now think it is the right thing to make it 5 years non-renewable, for the simple reason that you, as a regulator, it's actually quite, you regularly make quite tough decisions in a sense, and you fulfill that role of the independent person on the panel. And I do think to make it 5 years non-renewable makes it absolutely clear when it begins, when it ends. It allows you to maintain that kind of robust independence. So actually, I do think it makes sense, yeah.
One can't be robustly independent in year 6.
No, I just think it comes back to saying...
it's an exhaustible reservoir of independence.
But it comes back to what I said earlier about how do you ensure that systems are reliable, are compliant, and all those things. And it is predictability. You know at the outset, you know what the rules are, and then everybody's clear about what the expectation is. And it allows us, as I say, for the moment, because we know how the commissioners come in, we can actually do a very robust rotation of ensuring what's... And similarly, we are now in a position where I know that the commissioners and we will be there for the next 2 years. And when you do some sort of deeper policy work, when you want to reflect on, like, let's look at the recruitment principle, let's look at some policy ideas, you want a body of people who've got a shared understanding, still bring their independence, and you've got a good work programme. So, yeah, there's merit in that.
Is it you who kicks off the process of finding your successor, or the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster?
Well, that's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Has he given any indication as to when he may kick off that process?
I think I'd be rather worried if you already talked to me about that. But in a year's time, I hope that we have that conversation.
And you're confident that a successor could be found within the year? They could be inducted and hit the ground running on day one? Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, we have part of the things with those tranches of commissioners coming in, the induction processes, annual reviews, sort of professional development, all that is really well in place now, and I think it's given us as an institution quite a robustness.
Baroness Stuart, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do on behalf of democratic appointments and ensuring that the machine stays well-oiled and ticking over. And thank you for appearing before us and for taking our questions and answering them so comprehensively this morning.